Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute. Hello, and welcome to episode 230 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. Crispus Attucks, Samuel Gray, James Caldwell, Samuel Maverick, Patrick Carr. These are the names of the 5 men who died from the wounds they received in the shootings on Boston's King Street on the night of March 5, 1770. Gray, Caldwell, and Attucks died instantly, while Maverick and Carr died within the days and weeks after the incident. Now, of these 5 victims, the evidence points to Crispus Attucks as falling first. And of all the victims, Crispus Attucks is the name that we can recall most. That is, if we can recall any of the names of the massacre's victims. But why is that? At the outset of our investigation of the Boston Massacre, we said we'd study the massacre, the larger context it occurred in, and its memory and legacy. And it's in part thanks to Crispus Attucks that the massacre has held such a lasting place in American memory. Now, to better help us understand why that is, and to guide us through this third and last part of our Boston Massacre investigation, we're joined by Mitch Kashun. Mitch is a professor of history at Western Michigan University, and he's the author of First Martyr of Liberty, Crispus Attucks in American Memory. Now, as we take our trip down America's memory lane, to see how Americans have and do remember this aspect of the American Revolution, Mitch reveals who Crispus Attucks was and the facts and mythologies about his life, why Attucks disappeared from the historical record after March 5, 1770, and why Attucks and the Boston Massacre reappeared in Americans' historical memory after the 1840s. But first, I'm coming to Albany, New York for a special event. It's called A Visit to Ben Franklin's World. The event will take place on the evening of April 25 at the New York State Cultural Education Center. That's the same building that houses the New York State Museum. Now, the event is sponsored by the New York State Archives Partnership Trust, and I've placed a link to details about this April 25 event in the show notes and in your Ben Franklin's World app. And I'm really looking forward to meeting you after the talk. All right. Are you ready for our trip through part of the United States' historical memory? Allow me to introduce you to our guest historian. Our guest is a professor of history at Western Michigan University. His expertise is in African American history and historical memory. In addition to writing numerous articles and book chapters, he's written 3 books, including The Curse of Caste, or The Slave Bride, a rediscovered novel by Julius C. Collins, and, most recently, First Martyr of Liberty, Crispus Attucks in American Memory. Welcome to Ben Franklin's World, Mitch Kashun.
Well, thanks, Liz, for having me on. I'm really happy to be here.
And we're excited that you could join us on our quest to know more about the Boston Massacre, Mitch. Now, in First Martyr of Liberty, Mitch seeks to explore how Crispus Attucks' death on March 5, 1770 in the Boston Massacre led Attucks to achieving long-standing and even mythic significance in American historical memory. Mitch, there's a lot we want to know about Crispus Attucks and the life that he lived and his involvement in the Boston Massacre, but before we get into those details, I wonder if you would tell us what brought you to study Crispus Attucks. What about Attucks did you find so fascinating?
Well, I first began researching Crispus Attucks in the early 2000s as I was completing my book, Festivals of Freedom, which dealt with 19th century African-American emancipation celebrations. And one of the things that was really central to these celebrations was Black orators imparting a sense of history to their audiences, the history of the African-American people. Every nation needs a story that they tell themselves and others about who they are as a people. And the broader society didn't even recognize that Blacks had any history or coherent collective identity. So that Black speakers at these celebrations very consciously challenged that dismissive mainstream historical narrative. And in the process, they recounted the glories of ancient Africa, modern West African cultures, and the accomplishments of Blacks in America. And in these speeches, I started encountering references to Crispus Attucks, first during the 1840s and then even more during the 1850s and 60s, Black speakers telling the story of their people used Attucks to demonstrate that African Americans had been part of the American nation from the beginning. They tried to revise those mainstream stories to include one of their own, and presenting Attucks as the first person to give his life to make the ultimate sacrifice for the American nation. At that point, I set out to learn more about who he was.
Attucks seems like a really interesting choice for people to remember because he did die as the first person killed in the Boston Massacre on March 5, 1770. And in a lot of cases, all the literature about the American Revolution basically treats him as a footnote in American history. I mean, books and sources about the Revolution really just don't seem to talk a lot about Attucks. And this really brings us to Tumek's question of what do we really know about Crispus Attucks? So, would you tell us who Attucks was as a person before the Boston Massacre?
Yeah, well, we really don't know much. And that's actually one of the things that also really fascinated me and drew me more into making this a book project to focus on Attucks. As best as we can surmise, based on the historical record, Attucks was probably born sometime in the early 1720s. He was born as an enslaved person in Massachusetts, a little bit west of Boston. Apparently liberated himself around 1750, and he disappears from the historical record at that point until March 5th, 1770, when he is involved in the Boston Massacre. And it's really the newspaper accounts and then the proceedings of the trial of the British soldiers who killed Attucks and 4 others on that day, March 5th, that provides any evidence we have about who he was. But the evidence is really scanty. So what really intrigued me is as African Americans in the mid-1800s were starting to use Attucks and tell his story, they, to a large extent, had to extrapolate or in some cases make things up about him to fit the story they wanted to tell.
Okay, so what are examples of the kinds of information or details about Attucks and his life that people made up to fit the stories they wanted to tell? And what are the different stories people wanted to tell about Attucks?
Well, Attucks becomes a very prominent figure by the 1840s and 50s, especially the 1850s, in African Americans' efforts to work toward the abolition of slavery and to achieve full citizenship rights for themselves. To preface that, I guess, one of the interesting things about Attucks was that he is almost completely absent from the historical record after 1770 until the late 1840s. There are very few references to him. Of course, there was a lot of discussion at the time of the massacre of Attucks and the others who fell with him. And there was a sort of mixed sense of who he was and what his significance was at that time. But after the 1770s, he largely disappears, and African Americans seem to be unaware of him or his role. So when Black abolitionists rediscover him in the 1830s because of several publications that had come out in that decade, they recognized that he could be useful in their work toward abolition and toward full citizenship rights. So to a large extent, it's probably true if we see the Boston Massacre as a beginning point of Americans' movement toward revolution. Attucks was one of the first, if not the first, to die in that conflict. And it's a symbolic sort of role that he comes to play for African Americans as the first to fall in the pursuit of American independence. So that's how he's constructed. As, again, the title of the book was a phrase that they used at the time, or some variation of it, first martyr of liberty, the first to give his life for the American cause. And it's an argument that African Americans were there at the beginning, that one of their own was the first to shed his blood on the altar of American liberty, as another sort of way they used to talk about this. And they played him up in that way as someone who had a burning desire for freedom, who was deeply involved with the American cause of independence, and in part because of that central role that an African American played at that time, African Americans in the mid-1800s should be recognized as full citizens of the nation.
You use the word constructed, and that fascinates me, that African Americans and others have constructed Crispus Attucks and what we know about him. You also noted in your book, First Martyr of Liberty, that there will likely never be a definitive biography of Attucks. So what do we know about the truth of Crispus Attucks' life? You know, who was the real Crispus Attucks? And how did you as a historian go about getting at those factual details of his life?
Yeah, I didn't set out to really write a biography of Attucks, and it's a good thing because, again, I really don't think one can write something like that unless new sources emerge. And historians have, for generations, looked for material on the life of Crispus Attucks. So I relied on what others had written in the past, and really the most useful information, as I said before, comes from the newspaper accounts from the period following the Boston Massacre, and from the transcripts of the trial. We get a little bit of information about who he was. We know that he was born in or around Framingham, Massachusetts. We know that he was a sailor. We know that he was based in 1770, at least, in the Bahamas and was working as a sailor up and down the Atlantic coast of the British colonies and possibly farther afield. We really don't know. There were some 19th century histories of Framingham that had some important information about Attucks. Some of it speculative, but some of it making connections with the prominent families in that area and some of the not so prominent families. Another piece of evidence that we think applies to Attucks is a runaway slave ad from 1750, which identifies a man named Crispus as a mixed-race person from Framingham who had run away from his owner, Deacon Brown. And that sort of jibes with what we hear about Crispus Attucks as a mixed-race person from Framingham in the Boston Massacre trial and in the news reports that came out. But everything else is very sketchy. And over the years, people have constructed family history of him that is plausible, identifying who his parents might have been. There was the Attucks name, or the name Peter Attucks was often used among Native Americans in the Framingham area. So there are various connections in some genealogical records and in some local histories from the 19th century. But in terms of records from his actual lifetime, very few and far between. One of the interesting things that happens when African Americans discover him in the mid-1800s, they present him as an unequivocally black man, as an African American person. They neglect completely his probable Native American ancestry. He was more than likely of mixed race with probably one Native American and one African American or African parent.
You mentioned that there were very few records of Attucks before the 1840s, but that he did appear in period newspapers that reported the Boston Massacre and in the trial records of the soldiers involved in the shooting. What did these records reveal about Attucks and his activities on and before March 5? In particular, Jeremy would like to know if Attucks participated in any of the Bostonians' earlier confrontations with British soldiers. And Jeff would like to know if Attucks was a member of the Sons of Liberty.
To Jeff's question, there is absolutely no evidence that he was a member of the Sons of Liberty, although plenty of people after the fact in the 19th and 20th centuries have tried to make those kinds of connections for various reasons. But no, there's no evidence that he had even spent time in Boston before that. So there's no evidence of any involvement in the revolutionary cause or any of the protests that happened during the 1860s or earlier. And again, we really don't know anything about his life other than he probably escaped from slavery in 1750, and between 1750 and 1770, more than likely was working at that time as a sailor and also along the docks along the Atlantic coast and in the Caribbean and perhaps farther afield. As far as his involvement in any other kinds of anti-British activities, the lives of 18th century sailors, the way I tried to piece together an understanding of what Attucks might have been up to prior to 1770 was in looking at a lot of the historical work that's been done on the lives of 18th century sailors. They were known to be a rowdy bunch and to some extent a revolutionary bunch. There were numerous mob actions against the colonial government, against the British monarchy. The British had a habit of impressing sailors from ships, boarding ships and basically kidnapping people, whether they were British subjects or not, to fill out the crew if a British ship had lost some crew members. There was a well-known riot in Boston in the 1740s of sailors who were up in arms, literally, regarding being kidnapped in this way. And we can speculate that Attucks also maybe had experienced some of these things, had been impressed himself. We don't know, but could well have had a beef against the British Empire and the British military. So that might have been part of what brought him to be a part of that mob on March 5th, 1770. But again, no evidence that he was involved with the Sons of Liberty or even knew any of those people. although people have speculated that after the fact in order to serve their various agendas.
You know, Erica Dunbar spoke with us in episode 212, which was part of our Doing History biography series, about a technique called informed speculation. She said, in cases where people really don't leave us a lot of documents about their lives, we really need to look at the experiences of others and at the context of the time and place in which they lived and acted to better understand why and how they acted as they did. And it sounds like you use this technique with Crispus Attucks by looking at the experiences of other early American sailors. Now, it doesn't seem like from the evidence that we have that we can really know whether Crispus Attucks was politically involved in this early stage of the revolution. But I wonder, are there any other ideas that we can glean from using informed speculation, based on all the evidence you've seen, about why Attucks would have participated in a crowd of Bostonians on the night of March 5, 1770?
Yeah, that's a tough question. And these are all really good questions. And I wish I could answer them more definitively, but that's the nature of studying someone who really did not leave much of a trace in the historical record. It's interesting, I mentioned people making up or speculating about some of Attucks' motivations or actions in order to serve their agendas. One of the things that fascinated me as I got more into the research is the kinds of agendas that people were pursuing in which Attucks played a role. And this begins at the outset, really, with the trial of the British soldiers, when the defense attorney of the British soldiers, one of them was John Adams, the future second president of the United States. Clearly someone who was supportive of the revolutionary cause as it emerged. But Adams's job in that situation was to get these soldiers acquitted of the charge of murder for killing these, what turned out to be 5 American colonists. And in pursuing that goal, John Adams focused on Crispus Attucks. There's several quotations that he used of identifying Attucks as the person to whose mad behavior was the cause of all of the death and carnage that took place there. We do have some eyewitness accounts that place Attucks certainly at the forefront of the mob. He was holding a heavy wooden club. He had apparently given a similar club to another person in the mob and was shouting epithets against the British soldiers. So he was definitely involved. He was not an innocent bystander. But Adams very craftily uses this person and uses the fact that he was of mixed race and that he was not a Bostonian as this mixed race outsider who was a troublemaker, who was there just to pursue his own decadent interest in mixing up with the British soldiers. He certainly did not see any kind of patriotic activism in Attucks. But after the trial is over, the British soldiers are in fact acquitted of murder. For some years afterwards, the citizens of Boston held these annual commemorations of the March 5th massacre, as they called it, and that's propaganda in itself, referring to this as the Boston Massacre, in which the persons who were killed were lauded as innocent victims of British tyranny. They very rarely used the names of any of these victims, and Attucks' racial identity was very quickly erased. These were all presumably white citizens of Boston who were upstanding, innocent bystanders who were just slain by the British troops. And that was a very effective piece of propaganda work on these annual commemorations in order to maintain the anti-British sentiment. And that persisted through the era of the Revolution. And then later, of course, as I mentioned, the Black abolitionists wanted to present a positive image of Attucks. They do identify him racially. They do claim him as one of their own and use his presence at the massacre as an example of African Americans belonging as a part of the American nation.
So it seems like the constructed memories of Attucks began really not long after he died in King Street. Like, we can see his memory being constructed in the records of the soldiers' trials and in the propaganda of Boston's Massacre Day orations. And speaking of those Massacre Day orations, they're really fascinating. So between 1771 and 1783, Bostonians held these big annual orations in places like the Old South Meeting House, all to recall the memory of the King Street shootings and its victims. But after 1783, these annual orations just stopped. So Mitch, would you tell us a bit more about these orations, their use as propaganda, and why the Boston Massacre seemed to fade even from Boston's memory after 1783?
Yeah, well, 1783, of course, is the date of the Treaty of Paris, in which the American Revolution was officially ended. The United States was now an independent nation. These annual commemorations between 1771 and 1783 were held primarily to maintain that anti-British sentiment, to help fire up the citizens to continue supporting the revolution by calling attention to this supposed atrocity committed by the tyrannical British military. After 1783, there was no real usefulness to that. There was no need to maintain anti-British sentiment because the goal had been accomplished. The United States was an independent nation. And beginning in 1783, the celebration of July 4th, Independence Day, sort of displaced the Boston Massacre celebrations in Boston and, of course, elsewhere across the new nation. And it's not as though the Boston Massacre were completely forgotten after 1783. It showed up in the histories of the Revolution that began to be written in the late 18th century and continuing into the 19th century. Some writers presented the massacre as a great patriotic act. Some were a little reluctant to look at an incident of mob violence as something that they should be lauding and maybe encouraging citizens to consider in the present political climate. Certainly by the 1830s, there was a little less positive coverage of the Boston Massacre. But through all that discussion, Crispus Attucks was very rarely mentioned. And this is why it took about 70 years after his death for African-American activists to learn about him and to see the value in perhaps using them for a different sort of propaganda in the pursuit of citizenship.
Yeah, it really seems like we do know a fair bit more about Attucks's constructed memory than about who he was as a real person. Now, you noted earlier that there were very few references to Attucks before 1840, and I wonder if you could tell us more about why that was, and about what was going on in the 1840s that prompted the memory of Attucks to be resurrected by Americans.
Yeah, it was really in the 1830s that this begins to come about. There were several publications that emerged in the 1820s and 1830s, and I think we have to look at the timing here to understand what's going on. 1826 is the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. So there was a considerable attention starting to be paid to commemorating events. We had the beginnings of the monument at Bunker Hill being established in the 1820s. Both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson die on July 4th, 1826, in this very symbolic moment 50 years after the Declaration. Revolutionary soldiers are fewer and fewer in number as they die 50 years after the conflict. And they're seeking their pensions. So there's a little more attention given to the surviving revolutionary veterans. And a few publications come out in the 1830s. One in particular that got a lot of people's attention was a couple of different memoirs by a person who was a shoemaker in Boston during the Revolutionary years named George Robert Twelves Hughes. And a good bit's been written about him in the past several decades. But Hughes, in his memoirs, recollects being present at the Boston Massacre and mentions Crispus Attucks by name and identifies him as a mulatto, as a person of mixed race, as a person of color. And there were a couple of other publications that mention Attucks similarly in this time period. And that is, I believe, where African Americans in the Boston area first learned about Crispus Attucks and recognized that he might play a role in their movement for abolition and for citizenship rights. So 50 years is an interesting time to take stock of historical events because the people who participated in those events are becoming fewer and fewer in number. And people look at the present situation to see how their own current leaders, their current society measures up to these significant moments in the past. And I credit that sort of environment with what's bringing Attucks to the attention of the Black activists who took up his mantle.
I think we're curious about these Black activists and why they felt the need to invoke and construct Crispus Attucks' memory. So let's explore this need right after we take a moment to talk about our episode sponsor. This episode is brought to you by the Omohundro Institute, proud publishers of award-winning books since 1943. Mitch made a really important point during our conversation, which is Black Americans have always been a part of the United States and its past. In fact, you can explore some of the ways that Black Americans were part of our early American past by taking a look at the Omohundro Institute's books catalog. Just visit benfranklinsworld.com/OI books and then put African American into the search bar. When you do this, you'll find titles that investigate everything from Black Americans' involvement in religion to the Revolution and to citizenship. And because you're a loyal Ben Franklin's World listener, the Omohundro Institute is offering you a special promo code so that you can purchase any title published by the OI at a 40% discount. Just use your special promo code 01DAH40. Again, save 40% off any OI book title by visiting benfranklinsworld.com/OI books and using promo code 01DAH40. I've placed the details for this listener-only sale in the show notes and in your Ben Franklin's World app. Mitch, I wonder if you would tell us about the state of Americans' memory about the American Revolution and about the narrative of it that they were telling by the 1820s and 1830s.
If we can relate it to this day and age, we're still concerned with anniversaries. I mean, in the 1990s, the 50th anniversary of the end of the Second World War generated a lot of attention in American society. So I think the fact that they're thinking about the revolution is not all that unusual. And in fact, it wasn't just African-American activists that looked to the revolution. There's been a good bit of historical writing on the ways in which working class people in the 1820s and 30s looked to the revolution as sort of a model for their own activism, seeking rights and protections for working people. We look at the very famous meeting at Seneca Falls in the 1840s, in which the Women's Rights Convention there used the Declaration of Independence as a model for laying out their demands for rights. And again, working people in the 1820s did this as well, using the Declaration as a model. So looking at the revolution as a model for people seeking to claim their rights in the face of what they perceived as tyranny resonated with people looking for working class rights. This is an era of reform in American society. And certainly in terms of abolitionists, the 1830s was a moment when you really have the emergence of this biracial abolitionist movement that was moving away from seeking gradual emancipation or seeking colonization plans to send blacks back to Africa, and really seeking to abolish slavery in the more immediate future and to, as far as African Americans were concerned, claim their rights as full citizens of the nation. So the timing there is, I think, an important thing. There's a lot of things coming together in the 1830s that makes Attucks seem like an important symbol to Black Americans.
Now I wonder if we could talk about one particular Black American, William Cooper Nell. Would you tell us about Nell and why he was the one principally responsible for reviving the national memory of Crispus Attucks?
Yeah, Nell's a fascinating individual. He was a young man around 1830. His father had been a Revolutionary veteran. Also fought, I believe, in the War of 1812, if I'm not mistaken. I could be wrong about that. He was well educated. He experienced certainly racial discrimination in one of the schools in Boston that gave an annual award for the best and brightest students. Nell achieved the honor, but was not given the award because of his race. He was probably an apprentice to William Lloyd Garrison in the early years of Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, with one of the most important anti-slavery newspapers of the antebellum period. Nell seems to have been everywhere there was any kind of anti-slavery activity in New England or wherever he was living at the time. He was also very well connected with other white abolitionists, and it was really his apparent conversations with Wendell Phillips, a prominent abolitionist, that got him interested in looking at history and looking at the experiences of African Americans in the Revolution. And this is, I believe, how he came upon Attucks. But Nell mentions reading the memoirs of Hughes that I mentioned earlier when he is corresponding with Wendell Phillips about studying the history of Attucks. And he's rather frustrated that he doesn't know more about him, but he persists. And William C. Nell was very central to a lot of causes. He worked with Frederick Douglass on the North Star newspaper starting in the late 1840s, attended many West Indian Emancipation Day celebrations and other anti-slavery meetings, and began telling the story of Crispus Attucks in these public venues and in newspaper editorials that he would write. In the 1850s, Nell, in his pursuit of historical information about Black Americans, and he was a student of history and is also a clever propagandist, he believed that showing white America that Black Americans had always fought for the country that would translate into them earning their citizenship rights if the natural right to citizenship was still being questioned. So he wrote a couple of publications, the longer of which is called Colored Patriots of the Revolution in 1855, that told the story of Crispus Attucks, told the story of Peter Salem and Salem Poor and various other African Americans who fought in the American Revolution, and also some who fought in the War of 1812. Military service here is being used as a sort of entry point toward citizenship. We've put our lives on the line. We've given up our lives for this country. We deserve to be citizens. Snell was very much active in the abolitionist movement. He's really one of the central figures that everyone should learn more about him.
So how successful were Snell and other abolitionists in using the memory of Attucks and the massacre to convince other Americans, white Americans specifically, that Black Americans should be considered citizens of the United States?
Well, ultimately, African Americans did become citizens of the United States after a grisly civil war. How much can we put on William C. Snell and Black abolitionists? I think they played a central role. They put these questions about African American citizenship before the American public in increasingly visible and vocal ways throughout the 1840s and 1850s, and certainly African Americans' service during the Civil War contributed to that cause as well. And in this context, Crispus Attucks comes up quite a bit when there was a question in the early 1860s about whether or not to permit African Americans to enlist in the United States military. Initially, Lincoln forbade their enlistment in the military until the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. The arguments that African Americans presented often look back to those soldiers who had fought in the Revolution and look back to Crispus Attucks in particular as someone who symbolizes African Americans' willingness to serve, willingness to sacrifice, and even though Attucks was not a member of the military, their military valor, that they had the skills to be soldiers and be effective soldiers. So Attucks comes up in that context. Actually, we can look well beyond the Civil War as well, that in the Spanish-American War, in World War I and World War II, when these questions are raised about African-American patriotism, Crispus Attucks becomes a much more prominent figure in terms of the first man to give his life for the revolution. How can you question our patriotism when Crispus Attucks is representative of Black sacrifice in the nation's behalf?
Now, after the Civil War, the 14th Amendment was ratified and African Americans became legal citizens of the United States. But then there was Jim Crow. And I know we're going to jump forward in time a lot here, like into the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But Mitch, would you tell us about Jim Crow and the role Attucks' memory played in the fight against that system?
Yeah, well, during the years of the Civil War and immediately afterward, as African American citizenship is achieved, at least on paper, there is a broadening of support for understanding that African Americans are a part of the nation and for recognizing Crispus Attucks as a hero. This really culminates in the mid-1880s when the city of Boston, with the sanction of the state of Massachusetts and support from various political leaders and other groups, erects a statue commemorating the Boston Massacre. And at the time, it's clearly referred to as the Crispus Attucks Monument. So that's really the sort of culmination of Attucks being recognized as an American hero, his incorporation into the public landscape. And that monument, of course, is still there on Boston Common. But at that point, as you say, the era of Jim Crow by the 1880s is starting to really become solidified, in which African Americans' rights on paper that were accomplished during the 1860s and early 1870s are being whittled away pretty quickly. And certainly by the 1890s and the beginning of the 20th century, African Americans' rights to vote, particularly in the South, are taken away. Things like sharecropping and convict leasing replace slavery as a means of racial control in those areas. Lynching is starting to escalate by the 1880s and 1890s, and really all these terroristic means of keeping African Americans in their place, in a separate place outside of the mainstream of American society. And in terms of the memory of Crispus Attucks, it follows a similar kind of path. While that culminating point of the Boston Monument to Attucks in the 1880s is sort of the last biracial movement to commemorate him for many, many years. After the 1880s, the mainstream society, mainstream histories written about the revolution or the massacre either ignore Attucks completely or present him as just this unsavory outsider, a ruffian, a good-for-nothing who was just making trouble and by getting killed basically got what he deserved. But really, after the turn of the century, we see very few references to Crispus Attucks at all from the mainstream society, from white society. So memory is segregated to a large degree. African Americans go through a lot of efforts to keep the memory of Attucks alive through all kinds of different means, certainly through publications, through works of history that are starting to be written by African American authors. They refer to Attucks, they talk about him as a hero. In public venues, one of the interesting things that happens a lot by the late 1800s and early 1900s is a lot of institutions and buildings and organizations are being named for Crispus Attucks. This started earlier, even in the 1850s, when black militia companies were naming themselves the Attucks Blues or the Attucks Guards. In the early 20th century, you start to see black high schools being named for Crispus Attucks, or movie theaters being named for Crispus Attucks, or veterans organizations being named for Crispus Attucks, and even, in fact, a slew of children being named for Crispus Attucks, parents naming their children Crispus Attucks Palmore or Crispus Attucks Jones as a way of keeping his name alive, because the mainstream society was completely ignoring Attucks and his supposed accomplishments, and by extension, ignoring and erasing all contributions of African Americans to American history and culture.
As Mitch just mentioned, African Americans used the memory of Crispus Attucks well into the 20th century to keep it alive. They used it during the First and Second World Wars, the Black Power movement, and even during the culture wars between the 1970s and 1990s. Now, Mitch, I know you've told us about some of the ways African Americans kept Attucks' memory alive during the 19th century. And now I wonder if you would provide us with a few examples of how they did it during the 20th century. You know, to do things like claim and see their citizenship rights protected.
As I mentioned, in times of war and in times, especially when African Americans' loyalty to the country or fitness for service is raised in some quarters, Attucks plays an important symbolic role. There's a lot of things happening, certainly by the mid-20th century, and in the aftermath of World War II, we, of course, have the emergence of the integrationist civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s. And Attucks starts to become even more prominent a figure here in African Americans' arguments for citizenship. And he begins to be recognized for the first time in many decades by the broader society. So between the 1880s and the 1950s, I looked through a lot of American history textbooks discussing the Boston Massacre. I have not found a single one that mentions Crispus Attucks in their discussions of the Boston Massacre. But beginning in the early 1960s, we start to see those discussions of the Boston Massacre include a mention of Crispus Attucks. And that sort of thing just sort of snowballed from there. And by the 1990s and early 2000s, it was hard to find a textbook that did not mention Crispus Attucks. So you can see the effects here of the integration of the civil rights movement. There was an attempt to integrate the teaching of American history. It was a very superficial kind of integration. Attucks was used as a token. He was the black guy from the Revolution. There was no real effort in terms of mainstream society, mainstream curriculum and textbooks to make the African American story an integral part of the American national story. But there was this token gesture of including a few African American names, and Attucks was one of the first to be incorporated there. But both blacks and whites had a lot of mixed feelings about Crispus Attucks during the tumultuous 1960s. Even as Attucks starts to show up in textbooks, of course, textbooks are of limited page length just in order to be used. So as you have African American figures showing up in these pages, there were a number of historians from the mainstream who objected, saying basically that more important white people were being left out in order to have less important people like Crispus Attucks included, even in a superficial way. So there was pushback against this incorporation of blacks into the mainstream. African Americans had mixed feelings about Crispus Attucks too. As the Black Power movement starts to emerge in the later 1960s, Stokely Carmichael, one of the prominent figures, he talked about Crispus Attucks, but he called him a fool. Basically, he presented Attucks as a racial sellout who died for white people while his own people were still enslaved. But Attucks' name was out there in a way it hadn't been ever before, really, or maybe since the Civil War era. And especially in the 1970s, as the bicentennial caught the attention of many Americans, all things from the Revolutionary era became a much more important part of American culture, at least temporarily. And Attucks was a part of this as well. In 1976, the Jim Beam Bourbon Company issued a commemorative bottle of 100 proof bourbon featuring Attucks' supposed image on the cover and the story of Attucks and the Boston Massacre on the back. You referenced the culture wars. And a lot of the wars of the 80s and 90s were about the incorporation of previously excluded groups into the story of the nation. These multicultural debates were very heated at times, and school curriculum was a big part of what caught people's attention and what got people rather angry about the incorporation of women and African Americans, Native Americans, working people, and excluding or challenging the credentials of some of the traditional heroes of American society. But Attucks becomes a prominent figure in some of those debates. He's treated in textbooks in a lot of different ways. And really, since the late 20th century, we've continued to see Attucks referenced in both positive, negative ways, even up to the present.
Speaking of the present day, where does the narrative and memory of Crispus Attucks stand in our own time?
It stands today pretty much where it had begun to take its place by the end of the 20th century. Attucks is recognized by many people as the first to die in the American Revolution, as a person of color, but to a large extent, he's really unknown to many people. I'm convinced that virtually every child who goes through elementary school or high school in a public school in the United States has had some exposure to Crispus Attucks, either his mention in a textbook or hearing something about him during Black History Month. But it's the kind of information that I think goes in one ear and out the other for most people. They have heard of Crispus Attucks, but one of the things I did as I was completing the book is I used Facebook to do an informal poll of some of my Facebook friends and asked them, without any kind of guidance and with the admonition not to cheat and Google his name, tell me what you know about Crispus Attucks. And most of these people who responded were, college-educated people, often with graduate degrees, who had no idea who he was. And some could identify him basically as, wasn't he a black guy who died in some war? Or he's the black guy from the Revolution. And to a large extent, that's the place that Crispus Attucks has in the American collective memory now. Either he's forgotten or he is the token black guy from the Revolution. And people don't really ascribe a whole lot of meaning to him unless they have a particular agenda that they're espousing. And really, it could be an agenda of inclusion and equal rights for African Americans, or there are some conservative political causes that have taken up Attucks' name. There is an organization called the Crispus Attucks Brigade of the Minuteman movement, which started in the early 2000s to patrol the southern border of the United States to stop undocumented immigration. So there's a group of African Americans in Southern California calling themselves the Crispus Attucks Brigade of the Minuteman movement. In Texas, there's another conservative Black political organization that calls itself the Crispus Attucks Tea Party. So looking back to using him as a patriotic figure to espouse, again, a wide variety of political perspectives.
Okay, so we've now talked a lot about the memory of Crispus Attucks and the Boston Massacre, and I wonder if we could now be more explicit about what the difference is between history and memory, and whether there's even a difference between them. So Mitch, is there a difference between the facts we know about Crispus Attucks' life and the memories we've constructed to remember and inform what we know about his life? I mean, is there a difference between the history of Crispus Attucks and the memory of Crispus Attucks?
History is rooted in research, evidence, and the dispassionate analysis of that evidence. And we come to certain conclusions about the past by interpreting the sources that we have available to us, looking at primary sources, engaging in some cases in reasonable speculation if we don't have concrete evidence to support something. But it's a rational, dispassionate analysis of evidence. Memory or heritage, which I put in the same category, memory is something that is more laden with emotion. Memory doesn't really care about evidence. It's what feels right to the people who are espousing a particular narrative. So the African Americans who wanted to construct a Crispus Attucks that would serve the needs that they were facing in pursuing citizenship rights, they created a Crispus Attucks who was literate, who was well-read, who was connected with the Sons of Liberty, who was a good Christian, who was a man of high character, and he was passionately pursuing the independence of the American nation. These are all the qualities of a hero that we like to see. And even though we have no evidence of any of those things, all those things may well be true, but we don't have any evidence of it. So history will tell us, well, we really can't make those claims. But the emotion of the story and the passion with which someone pursues a particular agenda is what helps to craft the kind of memory that African Americans have built around Crispus Attucks. And you can look at the American story itself in these terms as well. I'm not singling out African Americans for making things up about Attucks. We tell ourselves these stories as Americans about these people who came to this country pursuing religious liberty and building this society and loving freedom and hating tyranny and revolted against the tyranny of the British Empire and succeeded in that and went on to build this society based on liberty and equality, where everyone, according to their abilities, can rise up in the social status, and this whole concept of the American dream. And immigrants have pursued that story ever since. And there's some truth to that narrative, but it ignores a lot of evidence of problems with the pursuit of freedom and equality and all people having access to the American dream. And certainly African Americans have been excluded from that narrative and from a lot of the benefits of the American story. Historians are sometimes accused of revisionism as we try to challenge some of those mythic kinds of aspects of the past. We start to call attention to George Washington and Thomas Jefferson being slaveholders, and Thomas Jefferson probably having children through the sexual exploitation of one of his enslaved women. We look at Christopher Columbus as someone who exploited the Native Americans and instituted slavery and brought disease and devastated native cultures. We look at Carnegie and Rockefeller not so much as captains of industry as robber barons. So all these stories are complex, and the historical facts and evidence can be used to tell a lot of different kinds of stories, but the one that you grasp onto, the one that is sort of inscribed in collective memory, is the one that has the emotional connection that you want. And that's whether it's a particular subgroup within society or the nation itself.
And as we consider these differences between history and memory when it comes to Crispus Attucks, I wonder why you think it's important for us to study both the making and remaking of his memory and the history of what we know about him.
Crispus Attucks' place in American memory is really mixed at this point in our history. For many, he's a patriot and a hero, but for most, he's unknown or forgotten. But he raises questions about why certain figures are accepted so readily into popular conceptions of the national story, while others fail to make a lasting impact. Part of the answer, as far as Attucks' inclusion or exclusion, is obvious. For generations, mainstream American narratives systematically excluded Black heroes and Black accomplishments from the nation's story. African Americans' more recent insertion into those narratives has been really selective. For the most part, Blacks remain peripheral to the dominant Eurocentric narrative. But it's more complicated than that. My book, First Martyr of Liberty, examines how and why Crispus Attucks has been included in or excluded from Americans' understanding of the Revolution and the nation over the past 250 years. And this really raises questions about who can claim to be a citizen, a patriot, a hero, an American. So following his story through history and myth, I think illuminates issues surrounding the incorporation of African Americans' actions and experiences and perspectives into the mainstream narratives Americans tell themselves about the nation's identity. And really, since the last presidential election, Americans have been confronting historical issues more publicly and more passionately than ever. So I really think that this book is very timely in that it interrogates the process through which popular understandings of history are constructed. We are facing a crisis of historical understanding and national identity right now, and historians, I think, have to continue to engage with this discourse to help the broader American public appreciate how we've arrived at this juncture and how our understandings of the past take shape. They are constructed narratives. So historians, I think, have to take an active role in stimulating informed and civic public discussions about the critical questions of what America means and how we determine who is a legitimate part of this country and its story. And that's what I've tried to do with the book.
And now we should move into the time warp. This is the fun segment of the show where we ask you a hypothetical history question about what might have happened if something had occurred differently, or if someone had acted differently. You know, Mitch, I think in this version of the time warp, we really need to lend you our time machine, because we wonder, if you could travel back in time and have a conversation with Crispus Attucks, what questions would you ask him and what would you want to talk about?
Wow, I would really want to know his whole life story. I would be really happy to sit down and be his amanuensis. If he couldn't read and write himself, which we don't know, I'd want to know what was going through his mind as he entered the streets on that evening in Boston. It was early evening in Boston. Apparently, Attucks was sitting in a cafe having dinner and maybe a couple of beers. And the bells started ringing and people go out into the streets. Attucks was one of the people who went out into the streets that night and got caught up in this mob. I'd want to know, what was he thinking? What was his mindset? Did he really think that this was going to be a movement to remove the British from controlling the streets of Boston and elsewhere? Did he have a beef against the British from way back, from being impressed as a sailor? Was he involved at all with the Sons of Liberty or any of those other movements around the Atlantic? Those are the questions that I'd like to ask. I'd like to really know what his mindset was, what his motivations were, and that would go a long ways toward dispelling some of the myths, both positive and negative, that have grown around him for 250 years.
So what aspect of history are you researching and writing about now?
Well, I've really moved away from the 18th century and really moved away from the study of collective memory. My most recent project, I've encountered this African-American journalist named Charles Stewart, who wrote primarily between 1900 and his death in 1925. And this guy has not been studied at all. I haven't found any kind of historical work about him, but he was one of the most prominent Black journalists of that time period. And the thing that I find most intriguing about him is that he traveled almost continuously through the American South primarily, but also as far west as California and Colorado and into the northern states as well, and one trip to Europe. But he traveled continuously, writing these weekly dispatches to African-American newspapers about the communities he visited, the people he encountered, the things that they were doing that were good, the things that they were doing that he saw as problematic. He wrote with a good bit of sort of curmudgeonly humor. He spoke to national issues like presidential elections, World War I, World's Fairs. He spoke about lynching and African-American sports figures and some of the political issues of the day. But he really sheds light on a lot of Black communities in the South that he visited. And I'm trying to figure out what to do with him because he's so multifaceted and he wrote so much that I'm thinking of a cultural biography that looks through his eyes at the state of Black America in this very transitional time period between the age of Booker T. Washington and the era of the New Negro and the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s.
We like to ask questions, Mitch. So how can we get in contact with you if we have more questions about Crispus Attucks and historical memory?
Well, through Western Michigan University in the history department, I do have a faculty profile there, and I can be contacted through my email at Western Michigan University.
Mitch Kashun, thank you so much for joining us and for helping us explore the memory and legacy of the Boston Massacre through the life and memories of Crispus Attucks.
Thanks for having me, Liz. It was great fun.
We don't know a lot about Crispus Attucks, and most of what we do know about the details of his life come from newspaper accounts after the Boston Massacre and from the trial records for the soldiers involved in the shootings. These historical records, plus a few others, reveal that Crispus Attucks was likely the first person to die in the Boston Massacre shootings, that he was likely a mixed-race man of Native American and African-American heritage, that he was born in Framingham, Massachusetts sometime during the 1720s, that he liberated himself from enslavement sometime during the 1750s, became a sailor, and that he disappeared from the historical record after the 1750s, only to reappear on March 5, 1770. Now, after the massacre, Boston held annual Massacre Day orations, which evoked the memory of Attucks and his fellow victims. But these orations often just recalled the memories of these men without recalling their actual names. And then references to these men stopped altogether when the orations ended after 1783. But then, in the 1830s, a young African American from Boston named William Cooper Nell rediscovered Attucks in the archives. A smart man, Nell understood what it might mean for his causes of abolition and citizenship rights for free blacks if African Americans had a symbol like Attucks to point to and rally around. Here was a man of color who died as the first American in the American Revolution at the Boston Massacre. And thus began Crispus Attucks' transformation into the first martyr of liberty. Now, over time, mid-19th and 20th century orders added details to Attucks' life. They wanted Attucks to stand as a positive example of African Americans' participation in the Revolution, and to make a positive case for their inclusion in United States society. So, this is how Attucks became a fully black man, instead of a man of mixed racial heritage. How he became a politically inspired patriot and possible Sons of Liberty member, instead of a rowdy visiting sailor who participated in a riotous crowd. And how Attucks became a good literate Christian, when we have no evidence to indicate whether he could read or write, or whether he considered himself to be a Christian. Crispus Attucks became the man Americans needed him to be. He helped them argue for Black Americans' inclusion as citizens, as men capable of fighting for their country in the armed services, and as a people who have participated in United States history and culture since the earliest days of the American Revolution and its inception as a nation. It's through the life of Crispus Attucks that we can see how Americans use history and memory. History aims to get at why past people and events acted and turned out the way they did. It's an interpretation and practice based on the dispassionate use of facts, evidence, and reasoned speculation based on facts and evidence. Memory, on the other hand, doesn't really care about evidence and dispassion. Memory is about what feels right to the people who create, adapt, and espouse a particular narrative to achieve their desired end. So, the legacy and memory of Crispus Attucks and the Boston Massacre is just one example of how Americans have used and created the memory of the American Revolution. And they've done this throughout time to create, fix, and further the broader societies in which they live. Look for more information about Mitch, his book, First Martyr of Liberty, plus notes for everything we talked about today on the show notes page, benfranklinsworld.com/230. The Omohundro Institute has been the proud publisher of award-winning books since 1943. And now, the OI is offering you the chance to purchase any book from its large catalog at a 40% discount. Just visit benfranklinsworld.com/OI books, browse its titles, and when you find the books you want to add to your library, use promo code 01DAH40 to save 40%. Again, that's promo code 01DAH40. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts. So if you enjoyed our 3-episode series on the Boston Massacre, please tell your friends and family about it. Production assistance for this podcast comes from the Omohundro Institute's digital projects team: Joseph Edelman, Kim Foley, Martha Howard, Emily Sneff, Holly White, and Karen Wolf. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our theme music. Finally, over the last 3 episodes, we've explored the Boston Massacre, its larger context, and an aspect of its memory and legacy. And I wonder, did our investigations change the way you think about the massacre? Please let me know. Liz@benfranklinsworld.com. Ben Franklin's World is a production of the Omohundro Institute.